everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Good Mood Podcast. I have been wanting to do some version of this podcast, of this episode for a while, because cravings, especially sugar cravings, is something pretty rampant in my practice. And I feel like I could run an entire practice and health protocol or health mission on just getting people, particularly women, particularly premenopausal women, to eat protein. And I'll explain why, but a huge part of my practice in naturopathic medicine, I think in general, is to help people connect more deeply to their bodies, to understand what certain symptoms might be indicating in terms of what their bodies need to heal or need in terms of nourishment. And very often we know what certain things mean in our body, but maybe we're not paying enough attention to feel things. So a big cause of constipation, chronic constipation, is ignoring those subtle little cues of having to produce a bowel movement or not being comfortable having a bowel movement in public, and therefore repressing the urge, which then goes away and becomes stifled over time. And in that case, you might recognize what that feeling means, but not be in the right place, or not be allowing that symptom, that sensation, to guide you in how you care for your body. But in a lot of cases, I find that we also don't really know what certain sensations might be indicating, maybe because they're delayed, that maybe because they're an accumulation of certain behaviors and phenomena that occur in our body over time. And we have trouble deciphering or translating what those cues mean. And I think a huge, one of those cues, a huge topic, are cravings. Cravings are these body sensations that show up. They can show up in the physical body, in our emotions, in our mind. And very often we find it difficult to interpret them. And so I want to start off by guiding you through a couple of articles I wrote on cravings. The first one is called The Wisdom of Cravings, and that is the nature of this podcast today. And the second part of this podcast, we'll talk about a study done by a woman called Clara Davis in infants who had just been weaned from the breast and introduced to solid food, where she let their intuition guide them and found that if they just let their bodies tell them what to eat when they were presented with a wide array of different whole foods, they actually ate in a very balanced way that honored their bodies and made sense in terms of what their bodies were going through, whether it was healing from a fever or healing from a nutrient deficiency. And so even an infant has this inborn wisdom when they've never seen food before to detect certain nutrients in the food based on the sensations that those nutrients produce in the body. And if we allow that connection between our sensations, we let them guide our behavior. If we let the environment cue certain sensations in our body, and then we let those sensations guide our behavior, it can allow health to flow through us, because health ultimately is a negotiation between our bodies and the environment at any given time. Then the second part of this podcast, we're going to talk specifically about sugar cravings and how to start to strip away some of the muck that ends up jamming the gears between environment, body sensation, and behavior that those babies had felt flow through them so well. You know, as we are exposed to different foods and attitudes and ideas, all this muck can jam those gears that allow us to truly honor our cravings, and they can start to make a mess or make confusing this inherent wisdom that we carry within us. So hopefully by the end of this podcast, you'll understand that your cravings are not something to repress or to ignore or to feel, or to judge or to feel shamed by, that they're simply signals from the body indicating perhaps a need for something. And if we wipe the slate clean and allow these cravings to flow through us and dictate some wholesome and nourishing behaviors, they may guide us on the path to greater health, letting us know what our bodies need. And so whenever I sit with a new patient for initial intake, I always ask about cravings. I'll ask someone what they eat, run me through a 24-hour diet diary, like what you have in the last 24 hours. I ask them about their appetite. I ask them if they snack, if they cook from home, how much they drink in terms of alcohol, water, caffeine. And then I also ask about cravings and aversions, food intolerances, allergies, the whole gamut. It's a 1.5-hour intake. And from my many, many conversations about food, appetite, and cravings, I find the most common responses are that people crave salt or sugar. And many people fall on one end of the preference range or the other. So some will say things like, I'm a salt craver, or others will say, oh, I've got a sweet tooth. But cravings are so much more than that. So I believe through the work I've done and what I've observed and what I've read, that cravings are a beautifully intricate process in which our body is trying to speak to us about what it needs. Our bodies have developed taste receptors to directly quantify the quality of the nutrients from the environment. And while these days sugar is abundant wherever you turn, during our hunter-gatherer times, it was relatively scarce and therefore highly sought after. That taste. It's the taste of ripe fruit, the fruit that is typically rich with nutrients, and the taste of quality calories from carbohydrates, which may have been scarce in times of food shortage and famine. And so to happen upon a very ripe apple, or whatever the equivalent of an apple was back thousands of years ago, would have been a beautiful delight. We would have been rewarded with a beautiful taste in sensation in our mouths. And that would have guided us to eat more sweet foods, rich with all the nutrients that a whole apple brings. Salt or savory or umami cravings, sort of like the savory craving that was discovered in Japan, this taste, but cravings for umami often represent the need for more protein. And it's weird because many of my patients who crave salts and often just actual calories will find themselves guided by that craving to consume things like chips or crackers. So salty foods that are savory, but that actually don't contain much protein. And this is often where that wisdom gets jammed up, because we feel the craving, we are rewarded with a taste, but not the nutrient that taste would have represented in nature. So somebody would rather, eat a bag of chips, which is also easy to grab, especially when you're in an emergency situation with your blood sugar, rather than going and getting a chicken breast to grill up. Although in nature, it's more likely that if we had access to salt, it was because we were consuming broths and bone marrow and organ meats and these other really nutrient rich and also quite scarce foods. Our modern environment, though, as I've been alluding to, doesn't necessarily set us up to adequately translate and respond properly to certain cravings. Salted chips were probably not a thing in a natural environment. And therefore, the only way to satisfy a salt or a savory craving would have been through hunting, consuming meat or eggs or poultry or other savory foods. And it's interesting because I've observed my cravings over time personally. When I was traveling in Colombia, I was absolutely obsessed with broccoli. It was like I couldn't get enough of it. And the same thing happened on a month-long trip to Brazil in 2019. I was also really craving broccoli, Brussels sprouts, those sulfurous foods. Why was I craving these foods? Well, broccoli is rich in vitamin C, in sulfur, and certain amino acids, and it's also a decent source of calcium. And so I'm not sure exactly what the nutrient might have been that I was lacking on my travels, but it's possible that these cravings for this specific food meant that I needed something from broccoli. And so I tried to honor those cravings, and I looked for broccoli in the many buffets in the Brazilian town I was staying in. And I treated broccoli as if it was some magic elixir of health and tried to eat as much of it as I could until I felt satiated by the experience of eating broccoli. And I also had the experience years ago, more than a decade ago, after developing a significant iron deficiency, because I had spent a few years as a vegetarian, I became very attracted, almost like very suddenly, by the smell of roasting chicken from a local Korean restaurant that I was passing by while I was walking the streets of downtown Toronto. And the wafting smell of roasting poultry had this majestic aroma, and it was impossible to ignore. And as a vegetarian, you can imagine that I might have thought that that smell is the smell of sin or temptation or suffering, but it was actually just smelled like health. Something about it just smelled right. And in my mind at the time, there was no doubt that the delicious fumes that were interacting with my smell receptors were indication that I needed to honor my body and probably start eating this food again. And I did. And, over time, and as I've discovered what foods work best for me and tried to honor my cravings and clear up some of that gunk that stands in the way or that pollutes the wisdom of cravings, I've been able to reach a much more optimal health status than I've ever had in terms of my digestive health, my energy levels, my performance in sport, and even my mental and emotional resilience. And so, I'll also hear, and this is pretty universal, that some of my patients will crave carbs and chocolate the week before their periods. And so the ebb and flow of estrogen can affect our serotonin levels. A large dose of carbohydrates from bread or pasta or potatoes or whatever allows tryptophan, the amino acid that forms the backbone of serotonin, to freely enter through the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. And so this explains the effect that comfort foods like starchy, warm bread and pasta have on us, creating that warm after Thanksgiving dinner glow, right? The typical comfort food, the mac and cheese feeling. And if you know that, it can be really helpful. So the idea that we're going to talk about is that if we're eating whole foods and we're working with a palette of whole foods to meet our cravings, rather than going for a bunch of crackers or chips or some other comfort food, maybe you're going to be attracted to like oats with spiced apples on top or something like that. And that, again, it helps clean up the gunk that our cravings, our behaviors, and then the reward sensations feed back on us. Maybe it will attract us to eat more tryptophan-rich foods rather than just allowing tryptophan to get into the brain, whatever tryptophan we have to get into the brain. Maybe we will actually eat foods that increase tryptophan, because especially if you're vegan or vegetarian, tryptophan's relatively scarce. And rich sources of it are pumpkin seeds, poultry, eggs, and other foods like that. Chocolate is rich in magnesium, and it's a nutrient, in which many of us are deficient, because magnesium is found in leafy greens like spinach and chard, but the soil is also quite deficient in magnesium. So, and we also use up more magnesium when we're dealing with moderate to high levels of stress, which many of us are. And we're also in higher demand for magnesium during the luteal phase, so sort of that PMS phase of our cycle, or our premenstrual week. And so when you backtrack and think of the logical explanation for why chocolate, with its carbs from sugar and its magnesium, may be a real rewarding food during this time. And so, cravings are not just nagging, annoying voices or vices, thrust in the path to greater health and iron discipline and will. They're actually complex, intuitive, and beautiful. They may be important landmarks on the path to true health and wellness. They may be indications in our body like thirst or the need for air when you're holding your breath, or hunger when you need more food. Disciplines like intuitive eating and mindful eating have based themselves on the idea that our bodies hold intuitive wisdom, and our tastes, cravings, and appetites are essential for guiding us on a road to proper and optimal health, whether that be physical health, mental health, or emotional health. And so through removing restriction and paying more attention to the experience of food, we may be better guided to choose what foods are right for us. Again, this idea of opening up the rivers between our cravings and our behaviors, and allowing that experience, then, if I crave broccoli and I eat broccoli, and broccoli provides this satiating feeling that quiets those cravings, I know I've got something right. Allowing that feedback to happen, that cycle to happen, where I feel a body sensation, I respond to it, and then that body sensation turns off, or I get a different sensation letting me know that I've done the right thing, really helps us respond and attune to our bodies in a way we might not be used to. If you're thirsty, you drink water and the thirst goes away. This indicates to you that you've done the right thing. There's a book, however, called The Dorito Effect, and it outlines how our taste cues have been hijacked by big food. It's a must read. It's really, really interesting. And it talks about the study I'm going to describe in a few minutes. So, like having a sham translator, processed food stands between essential nutrients and the signals our bodies use to guide us to them. A craving for sweet that might have led you to ripe fruit now leads you to a bag of nutrient devoid candy that actually robs you of magnesium and other nutrients in order to process the chemicals and the processed sugar in the food. And so our body is confused. Sweet leads us to the behavior perhaps of eating candy or of ignoring the craving because we don't trust it anymore. And the response is not what our body wanted. And so maybe that craving shuts off. Maybe our body tries to find a different way to get us to eat fruit. Maybe now nutrition becomes more of a mental process than an embodied process where we feel a desire to eat a certain way. A craving for salt and umami, or hunger for just calories in general, because in reality, a lot of my patients are actually trying to restrict calories until that restriction, like holding a beach ball underwater, we just can't hold that down anymore. And then it pops up and we end up at the bottom of a bag of chips, when really we maybe should have been spreading that amount of calories that was in the bag over the 3 meals that we could have had during the day, and spend those calories, to think in calories, but it's not all about calories, but we could have spent those calories on more whole foods that are nourishing to the body, giving us the protein and the fats and the micronutrients and the complex carbohydrates that we need to fuel ourselves and live the lives we want. And so these cravings may lead you, to the bottom of a bag of chips, which are protein devoid and laden with inflammatory fats, and really might only trigger more cravings and shame, because your body's like, okay, you gave me that bag of chips, but that's not really what I wanted. I still want more. I've had that experience. I don't know about you, of just like being in the fridge, not being able to figure out what you want and trying all these different foods, and then, wondering if you just binged. And so it's no wonder that we don't trust our cravings, because we live in a world that exploits them at every turn. We're gaslit essentially by big food. We're like, okay, I want to eat something sweet because our body's like, sweet is what I need, because sweet gets me X, Y, and Z nutrients. And that's been this way for thousands and thousands of years. And we're like, okay, great. We grab a bag of Swedish berries because we want sweet. And then our body's like, I got sugar, but I didn't get anything else I needed. I'm not sure now what to think. So let's talk about this really interesting study by Clara Davis in 1939. She was curious about the instinctual nature of human cravings. And she devised a study that was published in the Canadian Medical Association journal, the CMAJ. And the study was called The Self-Selection of Diets by Young Children. So Clara gathered together 15 orphaned infants between the ages of 6 and 11 months of age who were weaning from breastfeeding and ready to receive solid foods for the first time. These infants before the study had never tried solid food or supplements, and they were studied ongoing for a period of 6 years, with the main study process being conducted over a period of months. So it's sort of hard to understand the way it was written down, but basically it was more of a 6-month intensive process where the babies were treated in the way I'm going to describe, and then they were sort of followed over 6 years to understand what their eating habits and health status was. So they were no longer babies by that end of that 6-year mark, but they're referred to as the babies or infants. So how the study worked was the babies were taken one at a time during meal times, and they were sat at a table with a selection of simple whole foods, 33 to be exact. The food contained no added sugars or salt, and the foods were minimally prepared, so they were just lightly cooked if they needed to be cooked. A lot of them were served raw. Not all 33 foods were given to each baby at each meal, because that would have just been like a crazily overwhelming buffet for a baby who's just been weaned to experience. But they were offered an opportunity to try everything, and they were sort of given a wide selection at every meal. And so the foods that they were given were water, sweet milk, sour milk, so lactic milk, sea salt, apples, bananas, orange juice, pineapple, peaches, tomatoes, beets, carrots, peas, turnips, cauliflower, cabbage, spinach, potato, lettuce, oatmeal, wheat, cornmeal, barley, rye crisp, which is a kind of cereal, I think it's still around now, beef, lamb, bone marrow, bone jelly, chicken, sweetbreads, which are organ meats, brains, liver, kidneys, egg, and fish, which specifically was haddock. So yeah, I mean, if you ate from that selection of foods, you would pretty much receive complete nutrition, and you would be getting everything the body needs. It's also interesting because a lot of those foods are foods that I don't have a taste for, like bone marrow, sweetbreads, brains. And so these babies, they didn't know, they had no association with these foods. They had no history with these foods. So they were really just reacting to the food as a substance. Like babies put everything in their mouth, dirt, toys. And so they were just reacting. It was their taste that was going to guide them through the process of interacting with these different foods. The nurses who were involved in running the study were instructed to sit in front of each infant with a spoon and wait for them to point to the foods that they wanted. And the nurses were not to comment on the choices. So they weren't supposed to say things like, oh, you want some kidney? They were just wordlessly to comply with what the infants wanted. So they would just offer them a spoon of what the infant pointed to or showed interest in or indicated, and just wait until the infant indicated what else they wanted, whether they wanted more or a different kind of food. And so throughout the study, Davis noted that all the infants had hearty appetites and enjoyed eating. And this is interesting because, a lot of parents struggle trying to get their kids to eat and convince them to eat, and they're throwing things on the floor. So imagine how these nurses were interacting with the infants. They were offering them a food if the baby pointed to it. And if the babies, rejected the food or stopped eating, that was sort of it for mealtime. So really, these babies were fully in charge of eating and feeding themselves, using the nurses for the manual like dexterity and for providing the food, obviously, but the babies were in charge of what and how much they ate at any given meal. This is very different from how we treat a lot of babies, and how we're told that babies need to be fed. So at first, the babies show no instinct for food choices, which makes sense. They've never seen these foods before. So they would just select things at random and explore the various foods presented to them. And so it's interesting that all of them tried everything at least once. But it's also interesting that 2 babies never tried lettuce and one never tried spinach. So it makes us wonder like how, spinach and lettuce are fine, but it's interesting. The most variety of food choices occurred obviously during the first 2 weeks of the study, when they were presumably in their experimentation phase. So they were eating almost everything, just sampling things and seeing what they thought about it. And their tastes also changed from time to time, which perhaps reflects some hidden internal mechanism, like a growth spurt or a nutritional need. And they would have really random combinations and sometimes just like be obsessed with sort of one thing at each meal. Like sometimes a child would have orange juice and liver for breakfast, which to me makes sense because, the vitamin C from the orange juice would help the iron from the liver get absorbed better. And maybe for dinner, another baby would have something like eggs, bananas, and milk, which is kind of random combination. And many infants began the study in a state of malnourishment. So they were orphaned infants, they were found in an orphanage, they were being breastfed and being weaned from that. So possibly their mothers or whoever was breastfeeding them was, or bottle feeding them, was malnourished. 4 were underweight at the beginning of the study, and 5 suffered from rickets, which is a condition caused by extremely low vitamin D. So, like everyone in Canada in the Northern Hemisphere has low vitamin D, but rickets is actually quite rare. That's when vitamin D levels are extremely low. and bones are soft. And there just isn't the ability for the body to absorb calcium to strengthen the bones. And so it's interesting that one of the babies with severe rickets was given an additional food, which was cod liver oil, in addition to all the other foods there. And cod liver oil is a very rich source of vitamin D, a natural source of vitamin D. And they observed the infant and saw that he selected cod liver oil very often for a while. So he got a little portion of it, and he would take it at every single meal. And then after a time, his vitamin D, his phosphorus, and calcium blood levels all returned into the normal range. And x-rays showed that his rickets had healed. And then he stopped showing interest in the cod liver oil. And, if you've ever tried cod liver oil, it's interesting to imagine that a baby would crave that or want that or really enjoy the taste of it. And yet this baby was medicating himself with this need, some internal craving or indication in his body was telling him to drink the cod liver oil until his vitamin D levels were normal, and then that craving shut off. It's often thought that by parents that children, if left to their own devices, will just eat themselves nutrient deficient. And it might be true in today's landscape of frankenfoods, like processed foods. But the infants in Davis's study, they consumed a diet that was balanced and very high in variety. So they actually analyzed the nutrients from the baby's diets, and 17% of their calories came from protein, 35% from fat. So babies' brains growing very rapidly during this time, brains are made of fat, and 40% from carbohydrates. And their intake actually depended on their activity level. So sometimes they'd be hungrier and it would maybe indicate that they were more active that day. Other times they'd have a lower appetite. And again, they just let their appetite guide them. And during the 6 years in which the infant's eating habits were under observation, they rarely suffered from any health issues. So they throve, which is also counterintuitive because they were living in an orphanage. And so, they have possibly histories of trauma. Maybe they don't have as much attunement or individual care. They're living very likely in conditions of poverty, and yet they were thriving. They had no digestive issues. They had no constipation. If they came down with a cold, it would last more than 3 days, the study authors recorded, and then they were fully recovered. And in the 6 years of the study, they all came down with a fever at once. So this fever, some sort of virus ran through the orphanage, and all the infants in the orphanage were affected. And so the researchers sort of noted how the babies fed themselves in response to the fever. And so during the initial stages of the fever, they had very low appetites and they weren't interested in food. And then right before their fevers broke, the researchers noticed that their appetites skyrocketed. And they sort of came back with a vengeance, and after which the babies were eating voraciously. And it was interesting that most of them showed an increased preference for raw carrots, beef, and beets. And that's so interesting because as their immune systems are working and their bodies are trying to clear this viral infection, they have this requirement for vitamin A, iron, and more protein, which are needed for immune system function and recovery, especially from viral illnesses. And so the habits of the babies to crave and select medicinal foods during times of fever and nutrient deficiency is such compelling evidence of Davis's craving wisdom hypothesis. So were their bodies telling them what they needed to heal? What was this mechanism driving them to eat foods that, when we stand back and look from a mechanistic perspective, makes complete sense? The self-selected whole foods diet seemed to have a positive impact on their mood as well. And so because this is a mental health podcast, it's interesting to record that a psychiatrist, Dr. Joseph Brenneman, wrote an article on these babies, and he called the article "The Psychologic Aspects of Nutrition" in the Journal of Pediatrics. And he commented on their mood, behavior, and affect. And he said, "I saw them on a number of occasions, and they were the finest group of specimens from the physical and behavior standpoint that I've ever seen in children of that age." And of course, there's no control group. There's obviously some possible bias that could be directing this or driving this statement. But it's interesting because, again, these are likely infants that came from some sort of traumatic history, had some stories in their past, and who were orphaned and living in an orphanage, and yet really were thriving in terms of their physical health and their mental health from anyone's observational standpoint. And it's so interesting, right? Because in our world, we often try to mentalize our food choices. So should I go vegan, or should I eat low fat, or should I count calories or reduce carbs, or I got to have my morning snack that's fruit and my afternoon snack is, hummus. We time our eating windows. We try to fast. We can't eat after a certain time. And we try to exert this discipline and this will over our body's inherent desires. And it's like we don't trust those desires. We try to suppress them. We try and make rules. And so often my patients need to be coached through food eliminations or given meal plans and templates, because the art of listening to the body, properly identifying hunger, what all those signals feel like in the body, differentiating those signals from thirst, fatigue, even inflammation, like I'm feeling this way because of inflammation, is another realization that could be very meaningful. And even emotions like boredom, anxiety, sadness, and hurt can be a long process. If you are 36 years old or 47 years old, these are many, many years that we've been taught to ignore these signals from our body, to use our mind to understand our experience. And so to bring our experience back to our physical sensations can be a long road. But I also wonder if we clear our palates and offer these palates a wide variety of whole, unprocessed, fresh foods, if our bodies would also settle into their own grooves, and maybe our health would optimize or improve in some way. Maybe our weight would hit a set point that feels good to us. Maybe our cravings and appetite will serve the purpose that they were meant to tell us what we need more of and what we need less of, or not at all. And so I wonder if we listen, what our bodies will tell us. And if we let them, I wonder if our bodies will exhibit the pure instinctual wisdom of nature and the quest for harmony and homeostasis that lives at the heart of the natural world. And yet this seems like a very daunting task. And so I do have to coach my patients, and I coach them, especially around identifying a very particular craving, sugar cravings. Because whenever you hear cravings, and I'm sure you saw the podcast title, The Wisdom of Cravings, and you thought, oh my gosh, what do my sugar cravings mean? And so I'm going to walk you through sometimes step one when it comes to a nutritional exploration or nutritional journey with my patients. So Quentin Crisp said, repeat yourself loudly and often. And so I'm repeating myself, as I often do, on blood sugar regulation and sugar cravings and what those mean. And I guess if I have to leave a legacy in the world of natural health and lifestyle medicine, if I could sum everyone's problems down to one key major concept, like if you can do that, and obviously you can't, and one key take-home action plan, it would be blood sugar regulation and eat more protein. And this is not because this is a universal thing that every human needs to do. It's just my patient population, who I see. If you're dealing with anxiety, depression, fatigue, hormonal imbalances, hair loss, overwhelm, ADHD, metabolic issues, digestive issues even. I mean, often there's stuff we got to do before for digestive issues before we can get you eating more protein sometimes. But if you're dealing with any of these conditions that most of my patients come into my office with, it's a pretty standard recommendation. So a few weeks ago, and pretty much every week in my busy little homegrown virtual naturopathic practice, I found myself repeating very often and not so loudly, because just like in a normal voice, like I'm speaking now, the importance of eating protein at every meal and the connection between the symptoms my patients were experiencing and blood sugar with virtually every patient I saw. This goes back to the babies. There's these sensations in the body, and my patients are describing to me these sensations. I'm hearing these sensations and tying them back to my experience, and also, how I've understood other people's experience, to this big pot, this collective unconscious of body sensations and experience. And I'm understanding that actually means blood sugar dysregulation, what you're experiencing, those symptoms. And this is actually what your body is communicating you need. Imagine describing to someone what it feels like when you've been holding your breath for 15 seconds. You're like, there's kind of this feeling, like this empty feeling in your lungs, and this like kind of, this almost spasmy feeling, and you just feel super, super hungry, I guess, to open your mouth and just breathe in the air. And that's what you got to do. And the person's like, are you sure? Like, I remember, this is an aside, but my friend was reading a book about animals, and she's like, beavers can hold their breath for 15 minutes. So beavers go underwater and they can just swim around 15 minutes before they need to come up for air again. I was like, imagine, beavers just forgot to come up for air. And we were laughing because we were relating this back to this phenomenon we have in modern society, where we will skip meals, or we power through lunch, or we, just don't get to bed on time, and all these ways that we override our body signals. Beginning of the podcast, I mentioned the example of suppressing bowel movements because you don't want to go in public washroom. It's like, imagine beavers just got too caught up in what they were doing, and they were just like, oh my gosh, I got to have a timer on my phone to tell me to come up for air and take a breath. And we're just laughing, and I thought I'd do a post on it, and then I forgot. But all of my patients, like in this 1 week I was practicing, seem to be suffering from some combination of the following symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, overwhelm, disrupted restful and non-restorative sleep, sugar cravings, emotional eating, binge eating or stress eating. Binge eating is actually a very specific thing, but often we say we binge eat when we eat more than we wanted to. Nausea, bloating, PMS, migraines, low focus and concentration, low libido, low motivation, poor exercise recovery, and weight gain, or this sense of puffiness or body image issues. Even it may not have anything to do with how you actually look, but this body image sense. And of course, many of these symptoms were presented as being unrelated to the other, especially in an intake. We're often going through each thing one at a time, and then we're putting the pieces together, maybe in that session as we're talking, because it's helpful to provide some insight for people to understand, what might be at the base of some of these things. And sometimes we're discovering this later on. But, we may think, okay, well, I know that my stress and stress eating might be related. Some people are just sort of figuring it as they're talking, which is totally normal. But we don't always necessarily connect, sugar cravings and low motivation, or sugar cravings, overwhelm, and low libido, especially when those symptoms don't occur at the same time. Like, I kind of always have low libido, or in other words, I don't have a libido. It's just gone. And I'll feel overwhelmed from time to time, and I crave sugar around 8:00 p.m. All those things may possibly and very likely are connected, but they're occurring or entering our consciousness and awareness at different times of the day or different moments in the month. And therefore, we're not always connecting them. Whereas, if you hold your breath for 20 seconds, 15 seconds, you're going to feel the hunger for air pretty quickly, right away, essentially. And yet the common thread that connects all these symptoms is, you guessed it, your blood sugar. And so I kind of explained it to one patient, who was telling me all these things going on with her. And I said, if I gave you a magic wand that you could wave to make all of your life's problems disappear, you would still probably be feeling this deep, disconcerting, restless, anxious, all is not well kind of feeling in your gut. And the reason for this is blood sugar dysregulation. So, in other words, your physical body is not at peace because your blood sugar is dysregulated. And that's going to give you a sense that life is not peaceful, that something is wrong, because something is wrong in your body. Your body is struggling to maintain homeostasis. So our body has certain physiological mechanisms that it likes to keep tightly regulated. Among them are blood sugar levels, which, and blood sugar controls the amount of fuel available to the brain for the brain's minute-to-minute functioning. Carbon dioxide levels in the blood, which we decrease by breathing oxygen. So buildup of carbon dioxide is that signal that you need to breathe and get air. Salt and water. When these levels drop in the body, we start to feel off. Our stress response gets triggered. You can measure cortisol in someone holding their breath, likely it's going up. Imagine the feeling of holding your breath. The carbon dioxide starts building in your blood, and you would probably over time pay someone $1 million if you had it to be able to take a breath, if that's what it took to get your next breath. And similarly, if you're thirsty, it's likely all you can think about, especially when that craving's gotten very strong. When our blood sugar drops, we feel terrible. And the symptoms, though, are anxiety, shakiness, fatigue, low mental energy, burnout, decision fatigue, waking up in the middle of the night, irritability, dizziness, and weakness, and an unsettled doom and gloom feeling. And very often we'll crave sugar. Now, why are blood sugar cravings so, not so obvious, like thirst and the need for air? It's because our body can regulate blood sugar on its own using the stress hormone cortisol. So when your blood sugar drops, your body uses cortisol and it raises blood sugar. The liver also releases glucagon, and there's a process called gluconeogenesis that gets blood sugar up and keeps it steady. So the body has these processes to make sure the brain is getting enough sugar at all times. And therefore you're not needing to carry around a glucose strip with you or eat 24/7. But sometimes our body's ability to maintain blood sugar gets a little bit out of whack, just depending on how stressed we are, how well our liver is able to, work and do gluconeogenesis. A lot of people suffer from non-alcoholic fatty liver. This is why there's this connection between NAFLD and anxiety that I see all the time, and inflammation, metabolic syndrome, and how we respond to insulin and how much insulin's floating around in our blood, and all these different things. And, despite all the symptoms my patients were expressing last week, one of the main issues they were contending with were sugar cravings. I just don't have the motivation to cook a meal, a lot of them were saying. And one patient expressed, I end up eating a bag of chips for dinner, even though I'm not really hungry. And I explained to them, because you would think that low blood sugar would result in the sensation of hunger. And I actually explained to her that you are hungry, but the hunger is just not manifesting in the way that you're used to. So let me repeat this eloquent and crisp loudly or just repeat it again. So if you ever find yourself at the end of a bag of chips or in the fridge, trying to figure out what you need, eating almond butter with a spoon and being like one part of you, like the angel on your shoulders, like stop, and the devil's like keep eating. If you're ever in that situation, at the end of a pie, like eating a plate of cookies, a pile of donuts, if you ever experienced that, you were hungry. You were hungry. That was hunger. There's a eating disorder expert, Tabitha Farrar, and she's the first person I've ever heard speak about this, but it's becoming more commonplace. She helps people recover from anorexia, and she describes something called mental hunger. So physical hunger, that grumbling feeling in your stomach, that empty feeling in your stomach, is the result of a hormone called ghrelin that increases gastric motility. And ghrelin builds up when leptin levels fall and our stomach is physically empty. And it creates what many of us assume are the sensations of true hunger. And I've read so many articles like, distinguish your hunger sensations. What's true hunger? What's emotional hunger? And so if you want to learn more about leptin and hunger and how to regulate, metabolism and get away from dieting, check out my course, You Weigh Less on the Moon. The link's in the show notes. You Weigh Less on the Moon. It's about, I think, $34. So, however, gastric motility, the grumbling feeling in your stomach, those symptoms actually require energy from our body to produce. So there's a reason why people with hypothyroidism, which is characterized by a low energy thermostat in the body, are constipated because gastric motility takes metabolic energy. If your body's malnourished, such as in the case of anorexia is an extreme example, or even just chronic stress and under eating throughout the day, we often don't get these signals of true hunger. It's sort of that same phenomenon of if you ignore the signal that you need to poop, your body's just like, okay, we're not going to poop ourselves. We're just going to relax everything. And maybe, we'll wait 24 hours and then tell her again that we're going to try and poop. So gastric motility can be a phenomenon that turns off. And so our bodies, they may simply just not have the battery power to create these symptoms. And yet we still need the nourishment. Particularly, we need to elevate our blood sugar and keep it more stable to supply our brains with energy. And we also need to take the burden off cortisol to regulate our blood sugar. Because if you haven't eaten for 5 hours and you're feeling more or less all right, cortisol is there. There's cortisol circulating in blood to get your blood glucose levels up. And so our body will send us signals, according to Tabitha Farrar, and this checks out in people I've talked to, our body will send us signals of mental hunger. So the sensation of hunger will be more of a mental phenomenon. Now, there's probably physical sensations underlying that, but our mind, we default to our minds, and that's sort of the point of the first part of this podcast was we've let our minds take over our habits, our habit regulation and our routines. And so we don't eat until it's like 12 o'clock lunchtime, or, I can get the right foods or dinner's ready. And we're not necessarily eating in response to physical cues unless they're really strong. And so strong hunger, gastric motility, grumbling stomach takes a lot of energy. So we might start to get these signals of mental hunger, like this feeling or this sensation of I can't stop thinking about the chips in the cupboard, that often leads to mindless binging as our body tries to replenish its actual physical reserves. Then we might think that it's emotional, that we weren't hungry, but if we actually check and look and take an inventory of what was eaten throughout the day, we'll find that it was not enough food to sustain an active adult. And so, if you're craving sugar, emotionally eating and devouring, chips in the afternoons or evenings, or feeling decision fatigue or this lack of willpower feeling, it's probably a good idea to start focusing on blood sugar. And blood sugar dysregulation is very tightly connected to our moods. We talked about anxiety and depression being symptoms, like overwhelm being symptoms of low blood sugar. And, think of homeostasis as a way that our body tightly regulates our machine. It's like a fuel gauge on the body's resources. And these resources are needed in times of stress. So when our blood levels of salt, sugar, or water dip, and our blood CO2 levels rise, we start to feel uncomfortable, right? That feeling of holding your breath, that feeling of being thirsty. And we can remedy and get rid of this discomfort by drinking water, or sighing, or deep breathing. So sighing, breath work, all of that helps offload CO2, helps us feel calm. Or eating something, get our blood sugar levels up. When these levels fluctuate and we fail to notice, our body starts releasing stress hormones. So it's like we have homeostasis where everything's perfectly in tune and our body's able to ebb back and forth. It's like, a boat on a stormy sea. The boat can kind of rock and tip and still maintain balance. Then a giant wave comes and capsizes the boat. And then you got to struggle to get it back up again. Cortisol is our stress hormone, gets the boat back up. It's also a hormone, like I said, that plays a role in that blood sugar regulation. And so when blood sugar dips beyond homeostatic levels, so when we stray too far off center, cortisol steps in to save the day. And so low blood sugar, just like high CO2 and low salt and low water, are stressors on our body. And the stress may look like morning anxiety, being tired and wired, waking in the middle of the night, unable to fall back asleep. And again, in these moments, you may not feel hungry. Your stomach might not be growling, but you might be feeling overwhelmed, anxious, irritable, unsettled, weak, dizzy, fatigued, frazzled, just like nobody's doing anything right. Everyone's dumb. So imagine this, and this is a scenario from a patient I saw a few weeks ago. So you imagine you're in a fight with your partner. You're both cleaning out the garage and it's hot outside. You're annoyed at the way he breathes, at the slow, methodical way he's going through your stuff, both of your stuff. The mess feels overwhelming, insurmountable. The heat is stifling. You're feeling your body tense. You're getting pissed off. You're ready for divorce. You're ready to set fire to the whole thing. And, you're grumbling, you're fuming, you're losing control. You have the good sense to just storm off and go inside. And, that you're, not acting great. You take a breather though, when you're inside, because you got some space now. So you're breathing a little bit, you're out of the heat. Maybe you eat something just because you're like, you're in the kitchen. Maybe you do it because you want to get comfort. You exhale deeply. Maybe you grab a drink of water, something cool. And gradually, as your body starts to shift into physiological neutral, your perception starts to change. The garage feels slightly more tolerable, the idea of it. And then you feel like you're ready to go back. And once you're there, you look at it and you're like, okay, it's just a garage. Really, this task is just about moving one box at a time, going through it, and then starting to the next box. I can do it. And before you know it, you're done. When blood sugar is low, our prefrontal cortex, the ego, like our ego, or the decision maker, the part of the brain in charge of executive functioning, so taking boxes out of the garage shelves, looking through them, sorting them, putting them away, planning, cognitive function, that part of the brain becomes depleted because it's very energy intensive. Our brain takes up 60% of the glucose in our blood. And chess players, they've studied them, even though their bodies are still, their minds are so active that they're burning through tons and tons of calories, equivalent to marathon runners. I need to fact check that, but I've heard it somewhere. And so when that part of the brain becomes depleted, we call this decision fatigue, like willpower fatigue, I've heard it called, or ego depletion. And there's a really interesting article in the New York Times. And in that article, it states, administering glucose completely reversed the brain changes wrought by depletion. When glucose is low, your brain stops doing some things and starts doing others. It responds more strongly to immediate rewards and pays less attention to long-term prospects. In essence, you stop being able to make calm and effective decisions. You stop being able to emotionally regulate properly. You stop being able to triage things in your mind, so everything just feels like this giant cloud of overwhelm. Blood sugar levels in the brain directly contribute to the feeling of being, like I describe it as being solid, like able to make rational decisions, feeling centered, feeling like you know who you are, you know what's right. That boat that's kind of bobbing in the waves, but it's not tipping over. You're able to respond to fears and anxieties, to emotionally regulate, to make competent and calm decisions. When our blood sugar levels dip and we start to spiral, we might start thinking erratically, gloomily, catastrophically, and irrationally. I had a patient, I was having a conversation with him, and he would crash at 3 p.m. every day after school. And he would tell me like his major depression would come back. And so I would kind of pick through it more. And he's like, and my depression would come back. And then I would, my partner would help me kind of work through it, and would say some things to help me, like to kind of be my prefrontal cortex for me, essentially. That would be the rational voice being like, this is just, you're just going through something, you're going to feel fine at 5 o'clock, that kind of thing. But I picked it apart a little bit more. I asked him what he had for lunch most days, to which he replied that he often worked through lunch, and asked him what he had for breakfast. And he said he had like croissant or a bagel or something for breakfast at like 9 a.m. or something like that. Or I don't know, 7 a.m. So his first real and only meal was actually dinner time. The rest of the day was a sea of grazing on ultra-processed, readily to eat foods, sugar, white flour, no real food in sight. And so, scarfing down an emergency granola bar every time blood sugar drops is a possible solution, right? Like replenishing glucose. Like people be like, I need to replenish my glucose and eat some sugar. However, when we eat carbohydrates just on their own, particularly those quick release carbs like white sugar, refined grains, our blood sugar will spike and then drop after insulin is released even more. And we go on that blood sugar roller coaster even more than we might have been before. So many of us start the day without food, or with a measly breakfast or toast or cereal or some other carb-only meal. And as I tell my patients, a serving of carbs is not a meal. It's part of a meal. There's nothing wrong with carbs, but a piece of toast with some butter, or like a bagel or a bowl of cereal, even granola, it's not really a full meal. Bowl of pasta, not a meal. Sandwich with like some muesli kind of toppings, not a meal. You know what I mean, right? That the bagel for breakfast, a sandwich and peanut butter for lunch, a plate of pasta for dinner. Carbs are an important part of a complete meal, but they're completely inadequate at keeping you fueled for long hours of mental, emotional, and physical labor that you engage in between meals. So you shouldn't necessarily eat low carb, but a real meal contains fats, carbs, and protein. And therefore, all meals, especially breakfast, I would say, and even snacks, should combine those three macronutrients in some capacity to assure proper fueling and blood sugar regulation. And these three macros are in many foods. In most foods in nature, like you have legumes that are a combo of protein and carb, and you have meat that's a combo of fat and protein. You have nuts that are fat, protein, a little bit of carb. And we need these macros to assist in blood sugar regulation. And so when you eat a proper meal in the morning, a meal with fat, carb, and protein, your blood sugar will start to rise slowly as you break down all those components in your meal. It requires less insulin to get the fuel into your cells because you're not getting this massive spike of blood sugar that your body has to figure out what to do with. Your blood sugar starts getting metered out slowly throughout the next few hours instead of being rapidly absorbed. And this means no more spikes and crashes in blood sugar, no more energy issues, no more mood issues, no more cravings, like those crazy sugar cravings where you're going to murder someone for like a bagel or something. A proper meal provides hours of calm focus, more of that willpower that we talked about, and more ability to concentrate and emotionally regulate, and more feelings of being solid and yourself. And so, instead of just toast in the morning, try adding 20 grams of protein to your meal. So a scoop of protein powder, 3 to 4 eggs, because each egg only has about 5 to 6 grams of protein, a piece of chicken even, 3 tablespoons of some collagen powder. In essence, having a proper meal, rounding out that meal with protein. Often we miss protein. Then for lunch, do it again. Have a chicken breast on your salad, have a piece of salmon or beef with, the veggies that you've served yourself. Make a smoothie with protein powder, have cold soak oats and add collagen powder to them, or tons of pumpkin seed butter. Make yourself an omelet, have a bean soup with a full cup of lentils or, enough beans. Eat tofu. Substitute wheat or rice pasta, which is really just carb, and often we eat it just with some sauce, Sub that kind of pasta for a legume pasta made of mung beans or lentils or black beans, which contain fiber as well as enough protein to just round out your meal and make it as easy and fast of a meal, but a more complete meal than just regular pasta. So I notice with my patients, when they start taking this seriously and creating these complete meals, starting with breakfast, they notice this drastic change in their mood. They feel more mentally, emotionally stable almost immediately. It rewards you very quickly, and they experience more energy. We often get our second wind in the evening. So this idea of like, I'm a night owl and like I'm kind of awake at nighttime. But so many of us work through our morning meals and we only sit down to a complete meal at dinner time. North America, the biggest meal, the most complete meal is dinner. Like most people have some sort of actual protein, carb, and veggie with their evening meal. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Jordan Robertson, pointed this out. She said, maybe your second wind is actually just your first wind purchased from the proper meal that you had when you finally sat down and nourished your body. And so people will always ask me when I get to this point, what about intermittent fasting? Because whenever I speak about breakfast, the importance of breakfast is at least one DM or question or someone saying, but I thought that, and then the topic of intermittent fasting almost always comes up. And so it is a good idea to give the body a break from eating, maybe 12 hours, enough time that you're not in the act of digestion, but in the act of, improving gastric motility, secreting digestive enzymes, repairing intestinal mucosa, etc. And this usually means it's pretty simple. It's just stop eating after dinner. Try not to have dinner too late and stop eating after dinner. So creating something like an eating window from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So it's called like the 12-12. Again, though, this is more mental modeling, and maybe this isn't exactly what we need to be adopting if what we're trying to do is gain more awareness of our cravings and learning from their wisdom. Many of my patients take this idea of intermittent fasting that they've read about and they run with it. And they're like, okay, I'm going to do the 16-8, which is 16 hours of fasting and 8 hours of feeding. And they give themselves permission to skip breakfast. It's interesting because all of the original studies on IF were done with skipping dinner. So it always started off eating within an hour of waking and then eating throughout the day and then stopping at whatever it was, like 4 o'clock or something. So actually early dinner, no food in the evening. That's most of the studies were done like that. But because our main meal is dinner, we shift that window. So my patients will wake up and they'll get through the morning on coffee and often cream and sugar, which isn't actually technically a fast. And then they eventually will binge after dinner. They'll get to the bottom of their bag of chips and they'll eat their cookies. And when they finally give their bodies permission to eat, they find that they kind of go crazy. And it's very rare that they'll draw that connection, that they undernourished it earlier on in the day and that resulted in them overeating, or sort of this sense of losing control or these insurmountable cravings later on in the day. Most of us attribute the feelings of lack of control around food an issue with emotional eating and willpower, and then we feel shame. But I find that in 99% of cases, emotional eating is usually just a result of blood sugar dysregulation, protein deficiency, and undernourishing earlier on in the day, like trying to diet, trying to be in a nutrient deficiency or a calorie deficiency. A morning without food is a stressor on the body, right? Because we need cortisol to regulate blood sugar. So what else does our cortisol need to do in a typical day? Does it need to fuel our workouts, get us through the workday, help us feel articulate and awake? Now it's also got to regulate blood sugar. Female bodies in particular respond to stress by becoming more insulin resistant, which further affects blood sugar dysregulation and affects metabolic health. And this is not what you want. If you'd like to restrict your eating window, research shows that removing after dinner snacking when our bodies are naturally more insulin resistant is probably the way to go. It's also important to, I would suggest, take a protein inventory. So sometimes I'll actually have my patients track their protein intake on a website or app like Chronometer. It's more mental modeling, but it gives you a bit of an experience of what it's like to eat more protein, actually quantify it, especially if your protein is coming from many different foods and not like the typical protein sources, which are animal foods. The exercise is often enlightening because patients will often see how maybe they're not eating much protein at all, like 30 grams or something, not even half of what they might need to fuel a day. And they might see how, when they actually make an effort to eat more protein, that they feel this change in their symptoms and they feel more energy, they feel more stable, they feel better mood. And by doing this tracking, they're able to make those connections. And maybe the tracking is what helps give us the knowledge and experience to then let us take those signals from the body and run with them. The next time you feel this, like, I can't get enough food, I can't get enough, I'm trying to eat all kinds of things. It's like, oh, maybe I just need to have chicken. Maybe I just need protein. That's what I often find. My friend and I have this joke: when in doubt, eat meat. When we ever get those like bingey, cravey feelings, when in doubt, eat meat. And that usually for us shuts it right off. So I'll often get patients to track their food for a few days to a week, and then I'll ask them, how do you feel in a higher protein day when you meet your nutritional needs and versus a low protein day? What's your energy like? What are your sugar cravings like? What's your mood like? Your mental focus and clarity? Can you use those symptoms of like, depression to tell you, oh my gosh, maybe I need like a proper snack? Conditions like OCD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, PMS, PMDD, cognitive issues, dementia, diabetes, prediabetes, weight gain, and bipolar all have roots in blood sugar dysregulation, in my experience. They're all in part inflammatory, and blood sugar is massive in these patients. Blood sugar regulation over time can start to lead to insulin resistance, which worsens blood sugar regulation. And insulin resistance is this phenomenon that's often detected far before any changes to lab blood glucose, which is the thing that's typically measured, starts to show up. Insulin resistance is a process in which the cells stop responding to insulin, requiring more insulin to be released by the pancreas. And this causes inflammation and weight gain over time, elevated blood sugar, and just a whole bunch of issues. And insulin resistance is on its own a contributor to mood and hormonal issues, cognitive issues like dementia even, and metabolic conditions, eventually diabetes. And this is definitely something that you don't want if this is happening in your body. If your ND has tested your fasting insulin and fasting blood sugar together and told you that you're dealing with some insulin resistance, you definitely want to work to get this under control. If you think you might have insulin resistance characterized by sugar cravings, fatigue, abdominal weight gain, difficulty losing weight, hormonal issues, mood issues, low energy, and cognitive issues, consider getting your fasting insulin and fasting glucose tested. These two numbers can give you something called a HOMA-IR score, which is used to gauge insulin resistance so you can work to reverse it before it progresses to something like prediabetes or diabetes, like type 2 diabetes. Often insulin resistance, inflammation, and stress are a never-ending cycle, and they all need to be addressed, with blood sugar regulation as one of the key foundations to getting your body's insulin signal working again. And signs that your metabolic health is healing are feeling more energy, less cravings, better mood, better sleep. As I say, repeat yourself loudly and often, and possibly some weight loss. And it usually, actually, the weight loss starts occurring, it might be delayed. It might start occurring 6 weeks into a lifestyle change program. And low calorie diets can also be a significant stressor on the body, affecting blood sugar. Make sure that your fat and protein intake are sufficient, aiming for about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight for an active person. This is essential to regulating blood sugar, cravings, mood, and energy. And for more information on how low calorie and restrictive diets can actually work against your weight loss, mood, and energy goals, check out my course, You Weigh Less on the Moon, link in the show notes. And so just some places to start, is perhaps start tracking your food, creating a diet diary, maybe logging in the emotions and body sensations you feel when you're driven to consume certain foods. Maybe taking an inventory after you've eaten. Have these, what are my body sensations now? How do I feel? What are my emotions like? Did this food satisfy the craving that I had? Perhaps start your day with a complete breakfast that includes fat, carbs, 20 grams of protein. Eat meals regularly throughout the day. Front load your calories, trying to eat maybe most of your food before 1 p.m. Aim for 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, or maybe something like 90 grams of protein minimum. Find some protein-rich foods that you can have in your fridge that are easy to grab, that you can use to fuel yourself.